We start a new topic today. As I mentioned in the email yesterday, there's, it was a little bit funny, this whole issue about the constellations and when is the water rising? Our Girsa has that happening in the fall, but as I mentioned, Tosus has the reverse Girsa, certainly with the rising waters and the melting of the snows, makes more sense in the spring, as well as the rising of Aries. But anyway, we move on now to a new topic. Now that we are done with this important discussion of when the world was created and when all these seminal events occurred, where the Gemara in its conclusion seems to feel that at least as far as the world was created, the question of Trufot, which is when we imagine, as Rashi says, when do we imagine that the constellations and the sun were put in its place, which would be on the fourth day of creation, because on the fourth day is when the luminaries are created. And do we sort of make that computation based on Nisan or Tishrei? And everybody assumes Nisan. And the only question was sort of, the dating of the Mabul. So it sounds like everybody agrees that the world, everybody, the Chachmei Umas Olam and the Chachmei Yisrael, I don't know who the Chachmei Umas Olam here are, but anyway, that it is from Nisan. So it's going to be pretty surprising when we get to a later discussion that says that our liturgy reflects the idea that the world was created in Tishrei. So the thing remains pretty unresolved, and I'm sure that if I was a Kabbalist or something else, I could explain to you how both are really true. Maybe one was when God planned, Allah b'machshava, the other was when it happened. They're two on different planes. Anyway, it remains unresolved. But we turn now from this discussion of when the world was created, which we got to based on the whole look at the Psukim by Noach, which was connected, to issues about 30 days in a year or a year, and et cetera, et cetera. And we now turn back to the list of things in which the first of Tishrei is the Rosh Hashanah for, and it is Uli Yirakot, for vegetables, which means that Maaser Yerek, and we'll talk about other Meiser in a second, goes, you cannot do 1 year to the next. Every year has to be taken Meiser on the grain or the vegetables of that year. If you have 20 bushels from this year and 10 from next year, and you take 3 units, a tenth, on all 30, or let's say you take 3 units from the first 20 to have an effect on all 30, then what you took on the remaining 10 is not meaningful because it does not work from 1 year on to the next year, even b'diavad. The other relevance of determining the years. Yes, we're going to get to why it mentions vegetable in a minute. The other reason that it mentions the idea of which year for Maaser is which year in the cycle. Are you taking Maaser Ani, which you take on years 3 or 6, or Maaser Sheni, which you take on years 1, 2, 4, and 5? Now, as I mentioned when we first did the first Mishnah, there are 2 questions you have to raise by the issue of the year of Trumot and Masrot. One is, what is the calendar date? And here it's 1 Tishrei. When we get to trees, it'll be also more interesting about the whole Tu B'Shvat issue. So one is 1 Tishrei. The other is, what event are we looking at? Mm-hmm. What has occurred by that date to determine whether it's this year or next year? You remember by the mice or by the sheep, right? The issue is, when were they born? Born before Rosh Chodesh Tishrei or after Rosh Chodesh Elul, or after Rosh Chodesh Elul? Born before Rosh Chodesh Tishrei or after Rosh Chodesh Tishrei, depending on how you pass them by the sheep. So here the question is, number 1, what's the date? And number 2, what event do we look at? Let's take a look now at the Gemara. Let's read a little Gemara. Yirakot, for vegetables. So Tana, we taught in Brisa, Yirakot, Ulemasrot, Ulenadarim. Not just vegetables, it says 3 things. Vegetables, Meiser, which is like all things Meiser, thank you, fruit and grain as well, and for vows. We'll see what vows mean in a minute. So the Gemara says, Lirakos Mainihu, what does vegetables mean? Maaser Yerek. So it means the Meiser for vegetables. So Hainu Ma'asrot. So why did the Breita mention both Yirakot and Ma'asrot? Right? It's already mentioning the Yerek means Meiser for vegetables. So it says, Tana D'Rabbanan v'Tani D'Oraisa. No, Meiser are the other things. It's the grains, it's other things. It's the biblical Meiser. So Ma'asrot means like the real Ma'asrot. Yerek is rabbinic, but the rabbinic Meiser and also the real Ma'asrot, the biblical ones. Now I want to pause for a moment and ask the question, what is biblical? Because the way you would read this Gemara would sound like anything that's not vegetables would be biblical, which would include fruit. Okay, and is Meiser on fruit biblical? Let's even say the Shivas Haminim, or not. Rashi throughout Shas says that the Torah only talks about Tumas and Meisers by the Gancha, Tiroshcha, V'Yitzarecha. Your grain, the 5 grains, Yitzhar, oil, which is your olives, and Tirosh, which is your wine. And only on grains, olives, and grapes is it biblical. For Rashi, everything else is rabbinic. There's a long Tosfos here that quotes Yerushalmi and so on that basically implies that the opposite, that not the opposite, whatever, that everything is biblical except vegetables. And therefore, fruit is biblical. And minimally, maybe the fruit of the Shivas HaMinim, but it sounds like basically even not that fruit is biblical. So this is a major debate in the Rishonim, maybe a debate between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, whether is fruit biblical for Trumas and Masros or not. Well, Rashi says no. Tosfos, in the end, after bringing the whole Yerushalmi, if you just want to see where Tosfos reverses himself, he gives the whole Yerushalmi and the whole discussion that fruit is biblical. And then Tosfos says like this, and then Tosfos ends by saying about 6 lines down in the middle-sized lines of Tosfos, 7 lines down, starts with the word Peros Doraisa. He says, in Kol Hani, or the previous line, Mashma Deshar Kol Peros Doraisa, Avaliyah Shalom Akain, to come up Birkadam and Maisa Charim Darabanan, etc. So in the end, Tosfos comes around and agrees with Rashi that only by grain, olives, and grapes is it biblical. So this is a big debate about whether Maser of fruit is biblical. Here the Gemara says, Yerek is Darabanan. The Doraita, Masrot includes the Doraita. Does that everything that's not Yerek, including fruit, or is it just a different category of grain, olive, and grapes? We'll be a little bit more. We'll take the questions in a minute. Okay, so that's what the two phrases, Yerakot and Masrot, rabbinic Maser and biblical Maser. So the Gemara says, releasing Doraisa Bereisha. Okay, so first say biblical, that's the more fundamental category. So first say Ma'asrot Uli Yerakot. Why do you say first Yerek before the rabbinic category, before the biblical? So the Gemara says an answer, it says multiple places. I did the Chavivale Aktima. These are the rabbis writing. They're a little partial to rabbinic stuff. They wrote rabbinic takanot. They also don't want people to downplay it. So they want to stay at first. Maaser Yerek, it gives it weight, that people should give it weight as well. Okay, the Tana Didan, the author of our Mishnah, why did he only say Yirakot? He didn't say Ma'asro. Where's, like as Dov said before, where's General Meiser? Why only vegetables? Tana D'Rabbanan, because you can figure it out. We're going to tell you that the rabbinic Maisrot goes by this, and certainly the biblical. Now, what's the certainly? We're talking about a date. You don't make a Kal V'chomer. If this goes by 1 Tishrei, then certainly that goes by 1 Tishrei. So Rashi says no. Certainly there's an idea that there's a fixed date. If there's a fixed date for rabbinic that determines which year and whether you take from one year to the next, certainly there's a fixed date for what is biblical. But you could say it otherwise. You could say the Kal V'chomer is that you would pattern the rabbinic after the biblical. Where would you, if you're making this category up of rabbinic maestros on vegetables, where are you going to base it on if not the biblical category? So if the rabbinic category is first of Tishrei, determines the year, certainly the biblical category, which is what it's patterned after, should go by the first of Tishrei. I'll take all the questions in a minute. Let's just finish this issue about the language of the list. Okay, so the Gemara says, Listi Maser, why does it say Ma'asrot? Why doesn't it say Ma'aser? It says, no, Echad Maaser Behema, Echad Maaser Dagan. No, Masrot includes 2 types of Meiser. Meiser Behema and Maaser Dagan. Now, that's a little bit funny because the whole issue of Meiser Behema was debated. Mm-hmm. Is it the first of El, the first of Tishrei? So the simple read of this Gemara is the language Masrot comes to take that position, that it's the first of Tishrei. Tosfos is very bothered with this because Tosfos says Masrot, it says Masrot all over the Tannaitic material, and clearly it doesn't mean Meiser Behema, and Meiserot means the multiple Meisers you take. Meiser Ani, Meiser Rishon, Meiser Sheni. So Tosfos says that it's really a different question. Tosfos says the question is, why did the author of our Mishnah not just say Maser? Meaning, you say the author of our Mishnah said Yerek, and you'll say if it's rabbinic, Kal V'chomer, it's still Raisa. Just say Maser to include all Meisros, rabbinic and biblical. Why not? Why just say Yerakot? And the answer is no. Had he said Maser, then it would have sounded like he was saying Meiser Behema, and Meiser Behema is debated. So he doesn't want to say Maaser because, generically, because that might suggest Maaser Behema. That's actually a matter of debate. So therefore he says Yerakot without using this generic term of Maaser. Okay, so listening Yerek, why does it say Yerakot? Why doesn't it say Yerek is Rosh Chodesh Tishrei? Trey Gavni Yerek. There are 2 types of Yerek, and it wants to include both. What does it mean, 2 types? Yerek ha-ne'egad, misha ye'egad. V'she'eno ne'egad, misha yemalei et hakli. Now, this is not a question of when do you determine the year. the year for which year of Maser it's in, and when you take out 1 year on the next, goes by Yerek, it's when it's picked. And that's something we'll discuss later. This is a different question, not the year that it's determined by, but remember we had the whole discussion earlier about, like, nibbling on grain and Re'iyas Pnei Habayis and all these types of issues about when is it Gemar Melacha. Before Gemar Melacha, you're allowed to eat from it. Even once it's obligated, you're allowed to eat arai. Only after Gemar Melacha, you can't even eat, snack from it. So by grain, that Gemar Melacha was that it was sort of winnowed and made into a pile and brought into the house. What is the Gemar Melacha by vegetables that you can't even eat arai? So it says vegetables that are bundled. What type of vegetables often get sold in a bundle?
Put a rubber band.
Yeah, rubber band around them. Broccoli, what? Corn. Okay, these types of things. All right, all those things that you bundle together, okay, they only are done processing when they get bundled together. Then they're like ready to go out to the store. Things that are not bundled together, I don't know, carrots I think generally, right, are bundled together. I mean, you can sell loose carrots, but often they're bundled.
Lettuce is not bundled.
Right.
Some lettuce.
Cauliflower.
Okay, tomatoes would be a good example. Anyway, those things. All right, those things, they're done when you filled up the vessel. You filled up your box of tomatoes. Now, what happens if the vessel doesn't get filled? So then it says, okay, then when you're done, harvesting. But that's the Gemar Melacha. That is not, again, the question of which year. The year is from the moment it's picked. That's the question about when is it Gemar Melacha that you can't eat temporarily. So it says Yirakot to allude to the fact that although vegetables all go by Rosh Chodesh Tishrei and all go by when they're picked, there are different types of vegetables in terms of this issue of Gemar Melacha. Now there are a few questions, Michael.
I have 2 questions. One is, let's say, in your case, like you said, you can't be master from 1 year to the next. Let's say I mistakenly did, and then what happens to that extra one? Is it like they still have some sort of kedusha, or can I just eat it?
Yeah, so that's a question about if you take too much maaser, is the maaser still chal? On the part, like if you forget next year. Let's say it was 20 units and I took 3, and I said this is maaser on the rest, right? Is it chal or not? Maybe it's chal on 2, but you don't know which 2, so it's maaser and chulin muravim zebazeh. So you have scenarios like that.
And the other
so
question is, we say dagan tirashanisa. Okay, so so do you actually have to give him every a tenth of all my wine? I give it to him wine. Let's say I just want to eat the grapes. Is it not halal if I'm not making it into?
No, you can take it on the grapes even at the time if you're only planning on the grapes, right? I don't know if anyone, although maybe I'm speaking too quickly, and I would have to check, that says that if you say it's about wine and oil, that means that if you left it as a status of grapes, you turned it into raisins or something, that you wouldn't be chayiv. You're only chayiv in the status of wine. Yeah, I have to check for that. On those saying that it's deraisa, only wine and oil, what would be if you left it as grapes?
I want to eat the olives.
No, I understand. I'd have to check on that. Yeah.
Can you say something about the question of yashan in terms of grain being chiyuv today?
Well, that's not relevant. I mean, to our discussion, it is relevant. But the same question you would ask is, talking about what moment is important is when the 16th of Nisan comes about and it's matir, the grain that's growing, what stage does that grain have to be in to be considered last year's grain? And that actually is a different stage, again, than the case of Masrot. Masrot, as we'll see, by grain is Misha Hivia Shlish, and by Omer, it's Misha Nishrash. Once it's taken root, if memory serves, then it's considered, then when the 16th of Nisan comes about, the Omer is matir it. But it is a related issue about a date for grain. Yeah.
So this idea of learning the code from the Maser group Daraita, isn't the nature of when they ripen and so on enter into it?
Right. Why don't you learn it from the same?
Sure, you can't do a couple from one to the other.
Right. So why? Right. So that's a very good question, and that we're going to get to. If you're patterning the dates after, why don't you pattern the events after in terms of what's happening to what stage? Why by trees do you go when they blossom, and yerek you go by when it's picked, and so on? The basic short answer to that is, and grain goes misha hivia shlish, at least by the difference between fruit and vegetables. The short answer is that the Gemara asserts that fruit will be the year that it blossoms in. all of like the rains that came during that year leading up to the blossoming are what it's still being nurtured on and getting its nutrients in even in the following months. So since its basic sort of sustenance was from what happened until the moment of blossoming, and after that point it's drawing on all the previous rains and nutrients and so on, then it relates to the previous year. Whereas a vegetable, since they keep on growing and you keep on watering them and they keep on growing until the minute that they're picked, so they relate to, they're growing up to the last minute. I mean, fruits growing as well, but they're growing based on sort of the nutrients that they're receiving, the sustenance they're receiving until the last minute. That's why the Gemara says, so conceptually it's the same. It goes by the year, where it's drawing its sustenance from. I mean, a vegetable could draw its sustenance from the previous year and this year, but obviously with a bias towards the current, towards what's happening right now. So that, at least conceptually, they're modeled the same with different nafkaminas. But it's a good question, and the Gemara will discuss why those moments that we look at are different for different types of grains and vegetables and so on.
Is the criterion of blossoming the same? Another way of saying the criterion of when the sap is running in the tree?
That seems to be the assumption.
So
Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, it looks at the blossoming, but it seems to be based on the assumption of when the sap is running. So yes, but that's a very good question that we're talking here about the dates being the same. The moments that you look at are different, and we have to explain why. Let's take a look now at the next Gemara. Tanu Rabbanan. You were out in your garden and you were plucking your tomatoes Erev Rosh Hashanah before sunset. And then you just continue plucking after sunset. So which is like, what? It's Yom Tov. So look at Tosmos. All right, so when you have your non-Jewish gardener out there, and you didn't tell him to pick it on Rosh Hashanah, you told him to pick the tomatoes, and he, Adaiti Denafshe, was going ahead and plucking them. So starting before Rosh Hashanah, and then 5 minutes later, after sunset on Rosh Hashanah. So they were just picked 5 minutes from one another. Look, even if you were violated Yom Tov, they're still chayiv in Trumas and Maisra. So, ein tormin Maisrin mizeh al zeh. You cannot take from the stuff that was 5 minutes ago on the stuff that is 5 minutes later, because they crossed the line of before and after Rosh Hashanah. From this, you see, by the way, not only the date of Rosh Hashanah, but the moment in time that we look at, the event that we look at is when are they picked. Okay, right? Because that determines picked before sunset or picked after sunset. Lefi she'ein terminim ma'asrin lo min hachadash al yashan v'lo min hayashan al hachadash. You can't take trumas and ma'asos from the new to the old. Oh, I see, Dov, what you're asking because of the phrase chadash and yashan, but it's not being used in the same way. Okay, you can't take from this year's on last year's or from last year's on this year's.
Okay, I don't know that there were Thai workers in Israel.
I don't. If it was year 2 of the cycle, and year 2 of the cycle is when you take, right, Maaser Sheni, going into the 3rd year, Maaser Ani. Maaser Ani is only year 3 and 6. Shniya Maaser Rishon and Maaser Sheni. So not only is a nafkamina, the Bible is very clear. It spells out, A, the date is Rosh Hashanah. B, the moment that you look at is when it's picked. Okay, C, nafkamina number 1 is, you can't take from one year on the next. D, nafkamina number 2 is which masra apply based on which year it is in the cycle. Okay, so if it is the 2nd year going into the 3rd year, then the stuff that was picked before sunset is you take first tithe and second tithe, with second tithe gets eaten in Yerushalayim. Shlishit, and the 3rd year stuff, the stuff that was after sunset, is Maaser Rishon and Maaser Ani, is the first tithe and the tithe of the poor. Okay, and then we'll look at in a minute now. Now the Gemara just diverts from, and I'll get to in a second. How do you know this idea that there is a Maaser Ani in year 3 and 6 and not a Maaser Sheni? So this is like a general Meister's question. You know, immediately where does it come from? Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Ki techalel laser es kol Maaser tvatcha b'shana hashlishit shnat ha'Maaser, and the end of the pasuk is v'nasatala Levi lager liyasam la'almana v'yachlu b'sharecha v'saveyu. So it says you take the Maaser and you give not only to the Levi but lager liyasam la'almana. Where do you ever give Meiser to Ger Yasam and Amanah? You give the Meiser Rishon to the Levi, and the Meiser Sheni we didn't Yerushalayim. So this is the one pasuk that is referring to Maaser Ani. It says you take the Maaser and you give it like Ger Yasam and Amanah. It says Shnat Hashlishit. the third year. Okay, so we assume it means third year and sixth year, right? There's two sets of third year. So that's where we get the idea that Maaser Ani is years 3 and 6. Now, how do you know it's not in addition to Maaser Sheni? And that's what the Gemara is going to now say. Shnata Maaser. Shana she'ein ba ela maaser echad. There's only, the way Rashi reads it, only one other maaser. Only, so there, in addition to maaser ani, there's only maaser levi. There's no there's maaser rishon. There is no maaser sheni. Just wait, the Gemara has all those questions. Ha ketzad, what does that mean? Maaser rishon and maaser ani. Umaiser sheni yibatel. So maaser rishon and maaser ani, and you do maaser sheni. Because ha maaser says there's only one other than this. So the Gemara says, "Oh, eino ela af maaser rishon nami batel." Maybe it's not ha maaser means this is the only one. No maaser rishon. This year just maaser ani. Talmud Lomar v'elo levim tedaber v'yamarta alehem ki tikchu me'et b'nei Yisrael et maaser asher nasati lachem me'itam benachalatchem. When you take from the children of Israel the maaser which I have given you as your inheritance, hikisho katuv l'nachala. The verse connected maaser to an idea of an inheritance. Ma nachala ein la hefsek. The same way an inheritance has no interruption. I mean, you inherit something, you don't lose it every few years. So it's yours. And in terms of the whole idea of shemitah, would even go back to you, even if you sold it. But regardless, it doesn't stop being yours. Av maaser rishon ein lo hefsek. There's also no interruption. So there's always going to be maaser rishon. And therefore, Shnat HaMaaser means that you'll have Maaser Ani instead of Maaser Sheni. Tanya Idach, or some have Tanya Nami Hachi, we taught another Braita. Kitech Halev, this is the same point, except learns it from a slightly different pasuk. Laser, Shnat HaMaaser, etc. Shnat HaMaaser, Shnat She'ein Ba Ela Maaser Echad, only one Maaser. HaKetzad, how is this possible? Maaser Rishon Maaser Ani, only Maaser Rishon Maaser Ani. Umaser Sheni Yibatel, and no Maaser Sheni. Yochel af Maaser Rishon Nami Yibatel, maybe also you wouldn't have Maaser Rishon, just Maaser Ani. Talmud Lomar, Uba HaLevi, and the Levi will come. Now that pasuk of Uba HaLevi, the context is by the third year, which is why that's particularly relevant. Let me read you the pasuk.
These psukim are Maaser Mina Maaser, no? Aren't these psukim Maaser Mina Maaser?
Not the ones we've been quoting on. The Ela Levim Tidaber is about, yes, that's about Trumas Maaser, but it still refers to the nature of it. So anyway, here it says like this. Yeah. Miksei shalosh shanim totzi et kol ma'asar tvuatcha b'shana hahi v'sninachta b'sharecha. So it's the end of 3 years, which is like the end of 3 years. But anyway, this is understood to be the third year of the cycle. Uva halevi ki ein lo chelik v'nachala yimach. Ger v'yatom v'almanah shir b'sharecha. So you have ger yatom and almanah. So we're talking about the year in which you have maaser ani, and it says uba halevi. Okay, v'achlu v'saveyu. So you see that you still have maaser levi. Uba Levi, Kozman Shabbat, anytime he comes, Tainlo, even during this third year of Maaser Ani. Now, by the way, in terms of Pshat of the Pasuk, you could say, Uva Levi, Kien Lo Vageri, that a Levi is a type of an Ani, because he doesn't have a Nachala. And there are Psukim that indicate that sense of the responsibility to the Levi, but also this responsibility because they are sort of don't have an inheritance and they're dispossessed and they're like the aniim. But the Gemara's understanding that no, the singling out of Levi, it focuses and singles out Levi. Then kama v'ager v'yatom. So that shows that you retain maaser Levi even during the third year.
So you do both.
You do both, right? There's always two ties. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer Eino Tzarich. You don't need that pasuk. Harei Omer, the pasuk we quoted before. Ve'levim tedaber ve'matalem ki tichum b'nei Yisrael et ha'maser shenatzat lem menachalatchem. Hiki shoa katuv l'nachala. It's linked to an inheritance. Manachala in lahefsek af maser rishon in lahefsek. Same way, no interruption by inheritance. Same by the maaser rishon. There were some questions, starting with Charlie. Yes.
Back in the Tosafot, Steinsaltz consistently in the text of Gemara changes Nochri to Goy, but he didn't do it for Tosafot.
Okay. I don't know why. He changes Nochri to Goy.
Throughout Shas.
Akum he changes. I understand, but
Nochri as well, yes. But he left it as Nochri.
That's strange, because some of the earlier texts do have Nochri, not Goy, meaning the Akum is clearly a later censored word, but that's interesting. Yes.
Are Leviim in years 3 and 6 obligated with Maaser Ani, or they just give to they just give
Leviim
their
on their own maaser?
Yes.
No, their own maaser. The Leviim only give trumat maaser. They don't
That's
give.
it.
Yeah,
They don't
give
use
meiser
Ani.
sheni. They don't give meiser ani. They only give trumat maaser.
But they have to separate. They have to separate the tie. They just get to keep it near themselves.
If their own grain. If they
On
say,
their own
that's
grain,
the thing. On the maaser they receive, they just separate trumas maaser.
Right.
If they actually are, have bought land and are growing, then they separate all the tithes.
Right.
And even a Kohen
Like
has to
everybody
separate
else.
truma.
Right,
It's
right.
just-
Like
it's-
So
everybody
maybe you can
else.
come twice, right?
What?
You say, all right, give me a master, but I'm also poor. I mean, you have some master on you.
In theory, yes. Yes. Okay. All right. So that was a very fast dot. So let's keep on going. Okay. Ulin Dari. Tanu Rabbanan. We're going to circle back to this issue of tithing. Don't worry. But first, we're finishing up the Breita that lists Yerek, Ma'asrot, and vows. So what's vows? Hamudar Hanami Chavero Lishana. Somebody says that takes a vow that he will not get any benefit from a certain person for a year. Monesh Nemasar Chodesh Miyam Liyam. You go to the same date on the calendar year, which isn't always 12 months if it's a leap year and so on. But it means you go back to the same calendar date, and then the vow is no longer binding. Then the vow is over, expires. Vim Amar Lishana Zo. For this year, I won't get benefit from this person, and he does it as a form of a vow, like Konam Hanas Ploni Alai for this year, Lishana Zo. Afilu lo Amar Ela Besrim B'Tisha Be'elul, even if it was on the 29th of Elul, Kivan Shigir Yom Echad B'Tishrei, Altalo Shana. Once it's Rosh Chodesh Tishrei, the year is over. This year ends at Rosh Chodesh Tishrei. Okay, now Afilu Lamanda Amar Yom Echad B'Shana. Now the Gemara is commenting, even if this is no longer the Breita, even according, we saw a whole major debate, 1 day in a year, 30 days in a year, how much do you need, like by the tree, in order that the next year gets incremented and so on, although we did have models like the king where everybody agreed, so there are different models. So here we're saying, even if in other cases you normally say that's not enough to count as the year, like here's a good example, again, which maybe is the most parallel, you rent a house for till the end of the year. There the position was, everybody said, it's only meaningful, it only ends at Rosh Hashanah if you rented it by the Rosh Chodesh Elul. Any later, nobody would bother renting a house for less than a month. Okay, so here we're saying the opposite. Nobody says you need a month. Everybody says 1 day is enough for the vow. Why is that? Till the end of the year. So making a vow you're doing to like afflict yourself, right? If you're making somebody else forbidden on you, you're making it, you're afflicting yourself. Right, Starlight, and you achieved that, right? You deprived yourself for 1 day, which, means that people do. They take vows even just for 1 day, whatever spirit, religious or ascetic spirit moves them. And, we don't say only for a long period of time. Maybe you want to do a tinus. People do a tinus for a day, so that's a meaningful type of an act, and therefore we will interpret it in the most minimalist way. And it is technically now the next year, the end of the first year. Okay, that's all we have to say about vows. Back to Maasrot. So the Gemara says like this. Tanan Hatam, like the two dots are confusing. 2 dots make you think you're moving on to a new topic. But remember, the Breita said Yerek, Maasrot, and Nidarim. So what?
You have 2 dots.
Yeah, you don't have 2 dots. What says Ulin and Darim?
I
Oh, interesting. Anyway, so we finished analyzing that Breita, Yerek, Masrot, and Nidarim, but now we're going back. The main theme still is Meiser Yerek and Maasrot. So let's take a look. Tanan Hasan, we taught over there in Maasrot. Hatalsin mishatit smach. So talsin is a certain type of a vegetable. Rashi says it is something which I think means fenugreek. What does your English say, people?
Fenugreek.
Fenugreek. Rashi says pinigreek, which is, I guess, fenugreek. Okay,
Yeah,
fenugreek goes from the time that it sprouts. Now, what that means in a minute. Hatru'ah, grain, from the time they're a third ripe. So now we are getting to the point, not what date. We can all agree the date is Rosh Hashanah. We're getting to the point of what moment in time, what is occurring to the fruit or vegetables. So the vegetables we said when they're picked, that was the earlier breakdown. Here we have something which is a type of a vegetable that goes from its sprouting. And we're going to discuss why that might be different. Not in the Gemara, but in Tosfos. I'll get to that. Grain and olives go from a third ripening. Okay. Now, how about the thing not mentioned here, of course, is we have grain and olives and vegetables. We don't have fruit, which we're going to see goes from blossoming. And what we also don't have mentioned, olives are fruit, but maybe they're unique. Rashi says doraisa. We also don't have grapes. and Tosfos brings Yerushalmi about a certain stage of ripening of the grape. Okay, so Minani Mili. Now I'll get back in a minute to why we have different times for different things, but the Gemara first wants to focus on this issue about Mishihiviu Shlish, because Havas Shlish, a third ripens, is the critical time for grain. Okay, so where do we get that idea of having ripened the third, and that is significant? So the Gemara says like this. Amar Ravasi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Umatubein Mishmeit Rabbi Yossi Aglili. So Ravasi says the name of Rabbi Yochanan, and some are inclined to say it was in the name of Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Amar Kra, the verse says, Miketz Sheva Shanim B'Moed Shnas HaShmita B'Chag HaSukkot. Right, that's by Hakel. At the end of 7 years, on the festival, in the year of the Shemitah on Sukkot. So the Gemara says, Shnas HaShmita Maya Vidata. What do you mean it's a Shemitah year? If it's after 7 years, then it's the 8th year. Okay, but Chag HaSukkos Shminisi. Chag HaSukkos is already after the 7th year. It's already the 8th year. So what do you mean you're calling it Shnas HaShmita? To tell you, any grain that was a third ripe before Rosh Hashanah, it still has the kedushat. That's defined by the year that it was a third ripe. So again, there's all defining it by which year for Shemitah, for the 7-year cycle, and for old and new grain. So if it was a third ripe during Shemitah, it's defined as part of the Shemitah year, and therefore even now that it continues to grow and you harvest it in year 8, it still has kedushat shvius on it. Now that's all very nice that we can infer from this pasuk. The reason it's called Shnas HaShemitah in the 8th year is because there's still stuff that we would harvest this year that has kedushat shvius. But where do you get the idea of shlish? Mm-hmm. The most you could get out of it, even reading Shnas HaShemitah, means there's still grain that we're going to be harvesting. There's still grain and things we'll be harvesting that have kedushat shvius. It doesn't tell you what stage they were in to give them kedushat shvius. So that we still have to unpack. Dov, you had a question?
Yeah, so we've had this a number of times, no ego minhag shvit or kedushat shvit, but you didn't plant it, right? It was wild.
It doesn't matter. There's an idea of kedushat shvius on anything that grows.
So what's enough?
That you first of all cannot questions about sort of making commerce out of it, using it for non-food purposes, a period of shas habiur. If it's not eaten within a certain period of time, then you have to destroy it. Right. Okay, so. But yes, thank you. I didn't spell that out. Okay, so now Amalei Reb Zera L'Ravasi. So now the one is going to ask, you prove that some stuff in year 8 still has kedushat shvi'it because it grew in the 7th year. But where do you get the idea that the critical issue is whether it was a third ripe or not? So Reb Zera said to Ravasi, the dimalo ayah klal. Okay, actually he asks another question before the question of a third ripe. Maybe we're not talking about the grain grew in the previous year. Forget the stuff that grew. This is like a Havamina we had before. Maybe if it's calling Sukkot Chag the Shemitah year, maybe there's like an idea of Mosifin Michol al Kodesh, right? Maybe you just continue the laws of Shemitah until Sukkot. Right? So maybe that's what it means. Maybe it's not about the Kedushat HaPeirot. It means it's Shemitah continues until the following Sukkot. Right? It's like the same way we're Mosifin at the beginning, we're Mosifin at the end, and it continues until Sukkot. So that was a Havamina before, you might remember. The grain did not rise at all, did not come up at all. We're not talking about stuff that's already grown and that it has Kedushat Shvius. We're talking about the practices of Shemitah in terms of working the land and planting continue until Sukkot. Reasonable read. So the Gemara says, no, that doesn't make sense. The festival of gathering at the end of the year. My asif. What does it mean, that gathering? Like you think pshat, right? When you gather in the grain. Haksiv ba'aspecha. It says ba'aspecha migornecha mikvecha. We already know it's connected. Okay, that pasuk is not in this pasuk in Shmos, but okay, we already know that the time is the time of gathering. Elamai asif. Why does it call the Sukkot asif? Katzia, it means harvesting. Doesn't mean gathering the stuff that's been drying out. It means stuff that you're harvesting on Sukkot. V'kim lehu l'Rabbanan, the chol tfuah sheniktzara b'chad, v'yadua she'iviyah shlish livnei Rosh Hashanah. And the rabbis knew that anything that is harvested on Sukkot, and here's the answer to the unasked question, was a third ripe before Rosh Hashanah. So the first question is, again, how have you answered his question? Maybe we're not talking about the sanctity of the fruit. Maybe we're just talking about the practices of Shemitah. So it could be, it's by reading the word asif as harvesting, what it's saying is, look, if it's calling it Chag Asif, it's saying you could be harvesting in Sukkot. So if you're harvesting, you're not maintaining the laws of Shemitah, because of Shemitah you're not allowed to harvest. It could also just be saying, again, this idea that if it's focusing us in on grain that is being harvested, not on a general issue of laws of Shemitah, but it's focusing us in on the grain that's being harvested, and that's significant is because it grew during Shemitah. And what stage was it at? And here's the idea of answering the other question, which is, where do you get the idea of a third? I can get the idea that stuff that grew during Shemitah and is harvested on Sukkot has Kedushah, but where do you get the idea of a third? And the answer is, because if it's ready to be harvested on Sukkot, then that means 2 weeks ago, it was at the stage of having been a third ripened. Mm-hmm. So now the Gemara is going to have Reb Zera is not so happy. So Reb Yirmiyah is not so happy. That was the first one, Reb Zera asking a question. Reb Zera was satisfied. Reb Yirmiyah isn't happy. Reb Yirmiyah Reb Zera. So Reb Yirmiyah said to Reb Zera, "V'kimlu l'Rabbanan ben shlish pachas mishlish." What, the rabbis are able to figure out the difference between a third and a little bit less than a third? Meaning, well, that's going to be the answer. Okay, so you harvested on Sukkot. Who knows? It was exactly a third. Like if it was anything less than a third on Rosh Hashanah, it would not have been fit to be harvested on Sukkot. What, they really can figure that out? That it's only fit to harvest if it was already a third before Rosh Hashanah? So Amarle, so he said to him, Lava mina l'cha, have I not told you many times? Lo tepuk nafshecha lebar mehilchasa. Don't take yourself out of the halacha. Meaning, don't start asking these like undermining, skeptical questions, that sort of challenge the whole system. This is the whole way of the rabbis establishing, precise measures and, ways of quantifying these lines of exactly how much. The arba'in sahu tovel, 40 sa'ah is the water you need for a mikvah. If it was 40 sa'ah minus a thumbnail, you couldn't go into the mikvah. A size of an egg causes is enough food to have this tuma of foodstuffs, because that's the amount that fits in your throat. If it's the size of an egg minus a sesame seed, it would not. Shlosha mitamei midras. 3 tfachim by 3 tfachim is the size of a piece of cloth that's considered fit to sit on, and therefore would get the tuma of a zav of a moshav. Shlosha chaser nima. You remove 1 thread from 3 by 3. Eino mitamei midras. It's not mitamei. Now, of course, what was the question that was being asked, and what was the answer that was being given? Was the question that, what difference does it make? How will halacha distinguish? Why should a tiny little epsilon make a difference in the law that applies to it? And then the answer is, because that's how law works. You got to create some limit and say, more than this, yes, less than this, no, and you have to have an arbitrary cutoff point, and this is your arbitrary cutoff point. It's like born one day before, we gave the example before, right? 1 minute before the new year, a baby born, you get the tax exemption. 1 minute after, you don't get the tax exemption. Okay, that's the way the law works. Now, but the question might have been, not why does the law make a difference with that line, but how can you figure out?
Right.
No, that's another question. How can you look at the grain and identify it not as measurable as these things?
Right.
That's a good question. I was thinking the question also was, how do you know that exactly able to sort of say that if it's harvestable today, it means it was a third finished. Meaning, if you had a halach l'moshe misinai, a third ripened, I'll accept the difference between a third and less than a third. But you're not doing it. You're doing it on your ability, on your sort of interpretation that harvesting now means 2 weeks ago a third. I don't believe that the rabbis are such scientists and that the world works so precisely that things that are harvestable on Sukkot always are a third before Sukkot. So it could be a particular application of this.
And the answer is?
And Dov wants to also say there's nothing to measure and quantify.
Exactly.
Then the answer would totally be off base because all these examples are measurable. Hivia shlish is not measurable. All the examples are things that you can take out your ruler and you can measure them, right?
Well,
What did you want to say? Dov,
Well, to respond to that, not exactly so, because you can't measure exactly a beta versus a beta less a sense. Or you can't exactly measure. You can't even measure a meter exactly unless you have the official, meter that's in a
right. But you do it as much as is humanly possible.
Right.
But by saying,
maybe that's his point.
Yeah,
Right. Yeah.
By saying that all these measurements are
Subject imprecise.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. What was I going to say before? Yeah. So if the question is, a beta is also it's like all these things are according to the average person.
Right. So that's what Rashi says about the Beitza. That's also some of these things. Right. And that also might be the answer. Like the Beitza is trying to base on a pasuk that says, well, how much food can fit in your gullet at one time? So ask the same question. What, the rabbis were such scientists that they can figure out exactly a Beitza? And I'm sure it varies person per person. Like the same way, if you're harvesting wheat now, was it a third or not a third? I'm sure it varies based on the season, based on how much rain, based on this, based on that. And that's the answer. Yeah. So we look at the aggregate and we do the best we can, and we come up with a number, and that becomes the number. So that seems to be the answer, right? And that also answers the question of how do you get from, evaluating the facts and get a precise number like this. Now, I want to say one last thing, and then we'll end for today, which is why this difference, and this gets back to the question before about, why vegetables, when they're picked, etc., why this difference here? Here it says hivia shlish. Why is this case of, of talsin, misha titzmach? Number one. And what does titzmach mean anyway? So Rashi says that it means that, did I skip a line about that, misha titzmach? No. Rashi. Anyway, so the question is, does that mean that the seeds are developed, or does that mean that the seeds are in it that are ready to be ripened?
I think
so. There is that debate. Oh no, that's just Rashi. There's a line misha titzmach lizraim. Oh yeah, I did skip a line. It says vazes right before the aleph. The aleph. It says hatalsa misha titzmach hatruv misha yaviu shlish. So my misha titzmach lizraim. So I forgot to read that line. Anyway, that Rashi says it means that there are seeds now in it. Tosafos says it means the seeds have developed to the point that they're fit to be planted. But nevertheless, why are these things going different? What's the issue of a third? What's the issue of misha titzmach? And Tosafos points out that the whole list in Ma'asrot about all different types of fruits and things that all go, every single thing is given its own separate time. So if you take a look at Tosafos, for example, Tosafos says like this. Venira Li, it's about, I'm trying to find, it's the big Tosafos HaTivu'ah. It's about, you see where it says Tanu Rabbanan with the little funny circle in the Gemara? The lines start with a funny circle, go across from that and down one line. So it says, Venirali, the kol osin shi'urin hu havash shlish shalahem. Okay, that all of these various things is the definition of hiviu shlish. V'hadalok tani mishaviu shlish k'tani gabe tuah v'zeitim mishum tebekulu ef shalitem b'em siman chutz mituah v'zeitim. That there's a list of, and this gets back to the question of how do you know, there's a list of identifiable moments by other things which is equivalent to a third ripen. But grain, there's nothing identifiable, so you just have to leave it at the quantifiable amount. But all the different sort of measurements, criteria that you find by different types of fruits, etc., are all based on an application of the idea of shlish. Right? Why is this fenugreek from the time it sprouts? Darsh la Rabbi Zera midachsiv aser taser kol tvat zarecha davashu nizra umatzmiach yatsa pachos mitshlish she'eno nizra umatzmiach. So here's another significant thing. Why is a third relevant? Because once it's a third ripe, you can use the seeds for planting. Less than a third ripe, you cannot. So if chalsin misha titzmach means the seeds are fit for planting, then this idea of this fenugreek of misha titzmach is an application of the idea of shalish. Okay,
Why did you say that then?
I don't know, whatever. And then he goes on. Okay, so we'll talk about this more tomorrow. But here you have this idea that that things are a shlish, but how that might be applied by grain, it might be hard to quantify. Other things that might be hard to qualify, I should say, in terms of to look at signs for it. But other things are given other times because Tosafos understands an application of shlish, and the significance, which is not so far said in the Gemara, is the idea that at that stage it's when the seeds are ready to be planted by the grain, and that's why that becomes a significant moment. Okay, more tomorrow. All right. When was the last time we finished 15 minutes early?